Hello again. Now, today we're also focusing on how weak political leadership impacts infrastructure service delivery. Poor governance and the resulting policies also directly impact our economy. South Africa's frustratingly slow economic growth is a result of the degradation in the country's capacity to produce goods and services. A lot of complex factors there intersecting. Let's unpack them now with the Chief Economist at Investec, Annabel Bishop. Annabel, good afternoon. Welcome to today. Quite a complex cocktail of difficulties and problems that South Africa is facing. I had a chat in the last hour with another person who's a risk officer of a small fintech business saying that we are facing a poly-crisis.
I think you're right, and we certainly see three key areas highlighted by the presidency, which is obviously the electricity crisis, the freight transport crisis we have in South Africa, and of course as well the crime that's happening. And we know that the presidential initiative with business is looking to address these areas, but obviously we've seen damage and degradation to Eskom and to Transnet over the past decade, and of course state capture and the grey listing, which obviously has come about on the back of that, really talks to the crime factors as well.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the crime factors. You and I, just before we came on air, off air, we were just sharing this news that came out last week, the latest 2023 Global Organized Crime Index. South Africa sitting now at number 3 in the continent after the DRC and Nigeria, and sitting number 7 in the world.
It's terrible, and actually just an excerpt from the report actually says South Africa boasts a number of pervasive criminal markets heightened by criminal actors, especially state-embedded actors. And of course, here they're talking about state capture and criminal networks that are highly interconnected. Interestingly, we also rank very highly on trying to combat crime. And in fact, the report says that one of the reasons why our ranking has deteriorated is because we are not combating it enough as we need to. In other words, it says South Africa also scores the highest in Southern Africa on resilience, driven by efforts of non-state actors to resist organized crime. And of course, that's robust national policies and laws and strong economic regulatory capacity, but it just hasn't proved enough in the past period.
Is it the execution? I mean, you could have these things in place. I don't know, what's your sense as an economist? I mean, where the weaknesses are, leadership, execution as well?
It's partly, I think, on the implementation execution front. Let's bear in mind as well that the recent collaboration between the business sector and government started this year. So it hasn't actually been able to have a sufficient effect yet in order to actually start to reduce that rating. But of course, as well, I think crime itself has probably proliferated.
Yeah. I mean, people in business also talk about the need for certainty when it comes to policies, but there are others who criticize some other policies that are in place. I'm just going to use one example. I mean, recently the Financial Mail had a feature where they had like 23 CEOs or leaders of various sectors of our economy, asking them what would you do in the next 3 months to resolve some of South Africa's problems and over the next year. One of them pointed out to the whole labor market policies that we have and said that maybe there should be a bit of liberalization there.
So I think that's something that we have been looking at really from a global competitiveness ranking over the past 20 to 25 years. And in other words, the Global Competitiveness Report, which comes out from the World Bank, has indicated that South Africa fares very poorly on flexibility in labor. And of course, that's the ability to hire and fire easily, the ability for labor to move around the country easily as well, many other factors. But of course, as we know, we do have a lack of skills in a number of critical areas in South Africa. We also have very high unemployment. We come from historically having many individuals who haven't obtained the skills that obviously the workplace needs as well. So there's many factors that actually go into it. I think, for South Africa, what for me is really key and what's really been damaging economic growth this year has been the poor performance of Transnet. And that's been happening over a number of years. The hollowing out of state-owned enterprises, the damage that mafia rings and crime has done to Transnet, for example, also, of course, Eskom as well. We hear about that often in the press. But nevertheless, the inability of Transnet to actually get the goods out the country. And that's really been very damaging for South Africa's exports and therefore for economic growth and of course as well for tax revenues. And our government now faces a likely revenue shortfall this year, when we are still going to expect to see overspending. And of course, every year, certainly the last few years, the overspending has been met with the ability of, provided by the revenue overrun, and that's unlikely to be the case this year, very unlikely. And of course, our budget deficit is likely to widen. Our gross debt, our borrowings obviously are at risk as well. That means that our credit rating could be at risk, and of course further rand weakness, and that really impacts the consumer very negatively, both because of fuel prices. As we know, petroleum products, petrol, diesel, etc., those are largely imported. Oil is certainly fully imported in South Africa, and of course as well there's the problems that South Africa faces in terms of a weakening exchange rate, which really have a negative effect on all other goods that we import, and even on our food that's produced locally but is priced in US dollars. If we weaken against the dollar, our food becomes more expensive.
Yeah, you mentioned one point there around the infrastructure, which is Transnet. I mean, that should be a lifeline for us in terms of import and export, but we know the state of the railways and then, of course, our ports and harbours. But Annabel, poor governance, the way you explained it seems to me it will be at the core or one of the chief causes of our economic headaches, because poor governance leads to corruption, for example, and it might also speak to a lack of political will by leadership to enforce some of the required proper governance.
I think, that's certainly a grave concern. I think we all feel it as South Africans when people are appointed to key areas of trust to head state-owned entities, departments, or even in other roles in government, and they've previously been fingered for corruption. They've previously, obviously, been either implicated or it's been alleged. I think all of those are grave concerns, or perhaps they've just been running non-performing SOEs. All of those are obviously grave concerns. I think that the worries is that, with crime expected to have become very entrenched over the past 10 years, over the Zuma period, and obviously risks that we are in a mafia-style state, as many political commentators have certainly mentioned, really means that crime is having a huge cost on the economy. It obviously leaches monies out of the economy that could instead be used to grow, for example, economic activity. If government is supposed to be spending money on housing for students or, for people who need housing, who are, people in lower income brackets, and that money instead is taken and spent in other areas by government officials, and they buy fancy homes, for example, for themselves, for their personal use, then the poor people in South Africa who obviously would have, looked to have homes built for them, or students, would obviously lose out very substantially. And there obviously are other examples as well, where someone would put through an order for some computer equipment for a couple of items where the prices are vastly overinflated, and that money really comes out of the mouths of people who would be on SASSA grants, or people who, would look for the 350 rand a month social distress grant to become permanent, for it to be a higher grant. And obviously the money's not there if it's being stolen in other areas.
Yeah, thank you very much for your time and analysis this afternoon here on Today on eNCA. That's Chief Economist at Investec, Annabel Bishop.